everyone. My name is Nick Moraitis. I'm the CEO at the Foundation for Young Australians. It's a pleasure to be here with the Australia at Home team, and today we're co-hosting this event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're gathering on all over the country. I'm on the Arakwal land in northern New South Wales today, and I'd like to particularly acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. This land was stolen and sovereignty was never ceded. We have a particularly important conversation today and some incredible guests, and shortly I'll introduce Lorraine, who'll be moderating the conversation. But before I do, I just want to say how timely the conversation is. There's obviously been a considerable discussion since COVID-19 first started about the impact it's having on work and livelihood, especially for young people. And today we've seen the Productivity Commission report released that came out to indicate really the evidence is bleak, that young people are arguably the most impacted by this pandemic. And I think the headline in The Age today was, it's scarring. We have our own research report, which we're launching today, the New Work Standard. And FYA wanted to consider in this report the impact on young people of flexible work, in quotation marks, on young people and their careers. Young people, as we know, are increasingly engaging in work outside of the 9 to 5. And that's in part-time work, in casual work, self-employed work, and also in what's dubbed gig work. We started this report prior to my arrival at FYA CEO, actually more than a year ago, looking at trends in flexible work and the drivers and motivations of young people, and the relationship between flexible work and quality work, the challenges that young people face in this new work environment. And we know now that COVID is having an extraordinary impact on young people's careers. It's really important that we ensure how we make sure young Australians have access to really good work. So this report that we're launching today, and I will share, aims to start the conversation about how we can set standards for the quality of work moving forward and think about Australia's economic recovery. How do we ensure access to good work is at the forefront of this effort? Before we begin the conversation, I'd also just like to briefly thank the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for their incredible support of this initiative. LMCF have provided support not just for this piece, but also a further piece that will look more specifically at the flexible economy and the impact on young people in Melbourne. This is so important given that Melbourne is experiencing some of the most significant effects of COVID at the moment. And I particularly think about all of you who are joining us from Melbourne today. I'd like to particularly thank Stephen Torsey from the Foundation for his support and contribution to help shape this research. So now, without further ado, I'd love to introduce our moderator for this session, Lorraine Negewa. Lorraine has first-hand experience participating in the flexible economy, and she has also been working with us at FYA social enterprise arm YLab, including to help inform and shape this report. So Lorraine, I'd love you to kick us off and help perhaps start by sharing some of your own experiences.
Thank you so much for that, Nick. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I am on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to any elders past, present, and any elders emerging here today. As Nick already mentioned, my name is Lorraine Gwenya, and I am part of the fabulous social enterprise that is a part of Foundation for Young Australians, known as YLab. And this report is particularly really important to me as a young person who's worked in the flexible economy myself, and the craziness that is COVID, that, you know, sprinkled way more drama into that space than anybody really wanted. So it's a report that's really close to my heart. Now, just a few virtual housekeeping things for us to keep in mind. We are recording this session to be uploaded later on today online. So please be respectful and not say anything that you wouldn't want on a public forum. For those of you who haven't been to any of these events before, it is quite chill, respectful, and very inclusive. So just for us to have a good experience, for all of us to enjoy this experience, we encourage you to keep your video on if you're comfortable to do that. We found that it just helps us feel like, you know, we're all together in a space. So please do that if you're happy to. And please, if you'd like, please put your name on the particular, like on your video, so that if you ask a question, we do know who we're asking to give us the question. There is a chat function, and that's where we'll ask you to send in any questions that you have as the discussion goes. Everyone is muted by the admin, and you will be unmuted during the Q&A if you've got a question that you'd like to ask yourself. If you have any technical issues, I think we already have our tech person. They've already put in the chat that, you know, if you have any technical issues, please message them privately so that they can help you out with any of that kind of stuff. Now, to get into our event today, we have 3 fantastic panelists who'll be joining us in discussing what we're here to talk about today. So we've obviously got Kelly Fawcett, who is our research and policy manager at FYA, and she's worked with other for-purpose organizations to create social impact in Australia and abroad. Kelly will actually be leading us and guiding us through, helping us navigate the report a bit, telling us a bit more about it shortly. We've also got Amit Singh, who has over 15 years experience as a business advisor, public policy professional, and a corporate lawyer. Amit currently works for Alpha Beta and was formerly with Equity Economics, who are actually the people who worked with us on this report. So thank you so much for that. Amit has also worked for Uber in the position of global head of policy, so policy and research. So he does have that lens of a platform. And finally, we also have Alison Pennington, who currently works for the Centre for Future Work. She's written for them on a different range of topics, but namely evolution of collective bargaining, future skills, labour markets and policies, and has a background in public finance and public sector unions. To get us started, I'm going to throw it over to Kelly, who's just going to paint a bit of a picture of the research report for us and let us know, you know, what are the key insights, what things have come out, and then we'll get a bit of a discussion going. So I'll let you take over, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. Very lovely introduction there. And I'll keep it pretty brief because I think we're all really interested in hearing the discussion and what comes out of that. But just for your reference, our new research report is actually now live on the website, and the link has been posted in the channel on the right-hand side. So anything that I'm referencing here today, you're welcome to go peruse at your own leisure. So as Nick mentioned, when we undertook this research, we really wanted to understand what was the impact that flexible work was having on young people's career trajectories. So we know that young people's engagement in flexible work has been increasing over time, whether that be through part-time, casual, self-employed or gig work. Since 1992, we've actually seen the share of part-time work for young people increase from 33 to 57% in 2019, and the share of young people in casual full-time work, so that's without access to sick leave or annual leave, has actually more than doubled since 1992 as well. But prior to COVID, we were particularly focused on the impact that the gig economy was having on young people. And we estimated that since 2016, there's been a 340% increase in the number of workers in the gig economy. And over 50% of those were young people aged under 35. But what we found through exploring these figures is it's really hard to capture the full extent and impact that flexible work's having on young people. And that's because the way that we're viewing, the way that we're legislating, and the way that we're measuring work is still through a binary. It's full-time work or it's other. It's employed or it's unemployed. It's employee or it's independent contractor. But we know that the reality for young people is far more complex. And in fact, young people engage in flexible work for quite a number of reasons. So in understanding the drivers that young people have for engaging in flexible work, we built on some work from the McKinsey Global Institute, and we identified that young people were driven to engage in flexible work in 3 key ways, whether it be by choice or financial necessity, whether it was based on their primary or their supplementary income, and whether it was aligned with their career objectives or not. And for young people, this was a really pertinent point, whether or not it was giving them growth for the future. And through those 3 key ways, we've found that creates 8 different ways of working for young people. And there may be more if you factor in additional drivers, but the message is really clear that young people engaging in flexible work are not a homogenous group. And through looking at how and why young people engage in flexible work, we therefore have a better understanding of the risks and opportunities that flexible work presents. And what we found prior to COVID was that some young people were exposed to a lot more risks. And then COVID hit. And in fact, all the risks that we'd identified in the report were actually realised. And in running focus groups and interviews in June with young people, either previously in flexible work or still currently in flexible work, they explained to us what COVID meant for them. And I think some of these results will come as no surprise, especially to us living through the second wave here in Melbourne, but not having access to paid sick leave, not having security of hours or access to redundancy pay. These have created real challenges for young people and, as we can see now, the community more broadly. So COVID has not only impacted young people differently as well because of the industry that they work in, be it hospitality or tourism, but also their contracting arrangements. And we've seen that casual workers have been first in the firing line in a lot of these instances. So in answering the question of whether flexible work is quality work, a bit of an outs here, the answer is it depends. So to better manage the risks of flexible work, we at the Foundation for Young Australians think that we need a new way of thinking about good work. And in response, we've developed what we're calling the Good Work Standard. And that has 4 pillars which underpin good work. The first of which is access and inclusion. How can we ensure that everyone has access to work that is free of discrimination and is inclusive? The second being protection and well-being. How can we make sure everyone is physically, mentally, and culturally safe at work? The third is quality and control. How can we make sure everyone has access to fair contracting arrangements, to a living wage, representation or advocacy to support them? And finally, growth and development, which we've heard time and time again is really important, particularly to young people. So how can we ensure that everyone has access to the skills or the recognition that they need to grow and develop their careers? So just before I hand back to Lorraine, we know that we don't have all the answers at FYA, but we hope this sort of starts the conversation today about what constitutes good work. And in thinking about that economic recovery and job creation, how can we ensure that we're not just creating a job, but a good job? So I'll hand back with that to Lorraine to talk about us and the panel more broadly.
Thanks for that, Kelly. Now, thanks for giving us a really good overview of what flexible work is and a little bit about young people's experience of that. Now, we do have 2 young people who are going to be sharing a bit more about their experience with us in a minute. But Kelly, you brought up something really interesting. You said that, you know, in your view, you know, you're a bit on the fence about, you know, is flexible work good work? Now, Amit and Alison, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Is flexible work good work? We'll start with Amit and then Alison straight after.
I think, thanks Lorraine, thanks Kelly, and thanks FYA for arranging this study for a long period of time, but also for your commitment in this space. I should say the answer to your question, I'm going to sit on the fence as well. I think the answer is flexible work can be good work. It can be good work, but it needs a series of different types of scaffolding to ensure that you get the benefit of it. And the way in which that scaffolding operates is on a number of levels. I think that it requires a certain amount of improvement in the way in which the flexible work actually operates, so the way in which it operates at an enterprise level, but it also requires the right policy settings and the right regulatory settings to ensure that the way in which we work flexibly is up to date in the way, in the way in which we expect work to sort of operate. So the answer to your question, briefly, Lorraine, is flexible work can be good work, but it does require it requires a degree of effort in order to ensure that. And I think that that's something that at the moment is lacking and something that we can make progress on.
And Alison, your comment on this particular question?
I think we need to be really clear about how we're defining flexibility, because I think unless we're doing that, the question will always be flexibility for whom. And I think what's happened in the last few decades is a really determined effort by a deregulation agenda that's been pushed by certain politicians and business community to deregulate and take away the protections of work and the value of work. So things like paid sick leave, annual leave. And so alongside that campaign to deregulate work has also been one to make existing secure jobs more insecure. So you've got the expansion of jobs that are insecure on the outside of the existing protections and those that are becoming eroding on the inside. And that's to do with deunionisation, the loss of, the weakening of protections in our labour rights. So I put this forward because I think what's happened is that there's been this strong campaign to say that flexibility means that it has to always be on the employer's terms. It's entirely possible to construct good, meaningful jobs that offer flexibility for employees and for workers. That isn't just about making it cheaper to hire and fire, which is what it means for flexibility in the eyes of business. So I think I would say flexible work, of course, can be great, but it has to be in the interest of working people. It's possible to do it. There are a lot of places in the world that do it. And I think we can redefine flexibility in this time to be something that doesn't come at the loss of basic protections that give people a good life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And in touching on what you've just said there, Alison, I think it's important that we hear from some people who are in this space, what it's been like for them. And specifically with thinking about COVID, obviously it's changed the way and it's impacted the way that we work. And we've got some young people who I'm going to throw to in a second that I'd like to hear from. Well, first, I want to hear what's it like, what's your experience in this flexible workspace, as well as what do you think are some of the biggest risks of flexible work during this time in particular, like thinking about COVID. I'm going to throw it over to Roshan Sapkota. Can you just jump in, let us know what's your experience and what are some of the biggest risks that you think you're facing as a flexible worker during this time?
To be honest, my experience is pretty good doing flexible work at this time, because we are kicked out from the job as soon as COVID started, as we were casual worker in hospitality. Then as soon as I start, I work for the Uber. As soon as I start doing the Uber, is so flexible. Like I can start whenever I want. I can stop whenever I don't want. Whenever I want to take rest and do whatever things. But the main thing is like sometimes it's the risks of your life as well, risks of the health as well, as the COVID is increasing and you need to get in contact with the people, walk around outside, because it's the thing how we work. To be honest, it has give the platform has given the life to many people like me. As it was taking more partners and the work started decreasing slightly, but it has been a part of our survival at this moment.
Thank you so much for that, Roshan. So you're actually finding that, yeah, there's been some positives because, you know, it's actually given you a platform to do some of the work that you're able to do. So that's really cool. Now I've got Ishara Sahama, and I'd love to hear about you, about your experience within the flexible workspace. And if you can actually comment on, do you feel like there's more risks within the space, or do you feel like there's actually some opportunities? I'm happy for you to touch on either one of those points.
Yeah, thank you, Lorraine, and thank you, Roshan, for your honesty and sharing your experiences. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm meeting on the Turrbal and Yagara land in the nation known as, or the city known as Meanjin, which is also known as Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander individuals participating in this event. So a little bit about me. I'm currently working in the flexible economy in terms of working in social enterprise and the not-for-profit space. So I'm currently working for a social business, which is, you know, it's an exciting venture because it's directly linked with the Family Business Australia industry, where the business itself is providing advice and strategic alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals. So then we can, you know, transform the business model of family businesses across Australia to more socially and environmentally responsible parameters. But working in that space has not been easy. I graduated at the end of last year, so December 2019, and then shortly after I you know, needed to take a break from work and everything because I was also working whilst I was studying. So I was doing casual work before I even, you know, started work outside of graduating. But again, as everyone has said, it depends. Flexible work is positive for whom. It's good for me because I am comfortable with working flexibly, working less hours than needed, because I'm someone who puts a lot of work in each hour. Not that people who work in a 9-to-5 job don't, but you know, my work ethics are very different from other people. And so I can do a lot more in less time, and there are other people in that space who do the same. But because I have the flexibility in terms of work hours, that's good. In terms of, you know, the policy and the fundamentals behind it in terms of insurance or liability concerns, you know, if I get injured for anything, which I most likely won't because I'm working from home, but if something happens and you know, I'm pressed for time for a certain consulting aspect of my work, I'm the only person who's setting the standard of accountability and responsibility for myself. I don't have a HR system to fall back on. I don't have a workplace union to fall back on. So in terms of that aspect, it's precarious because I have to do a lot of work to figure out what kind of safety mechanisms or safety nets are there for myself as an individual who's liable to anything, to fines or anything, or yeah. So does that answer the question? Sorry, I forgot the whole question, but yeah.
You absolutely nailed it. You gave us all the different views, and that's what we need to kind of hear, what it's like for a young person. So thank you so much for that, Ishara. I'm just going to throw a question over to Alison. I'd love to hear from you about what solutions you think that we need now to ensure young people have access to quality work as we reconstruct our economy.
Well, I think we have to start with understanding the scale of this crisis. Young people are still bearing the brunt of the GFC. Labour market outcomes have been declining since that period of time, and that goes for university graduates, any young person just trying to get a foot in the door. So once we can actually comprehend that we had a pretty serious problem with jobs pathways and youth employment before this crisis, then it bears thinking about what this current crisis does for young people, which is they are the largest group demographically in overall unemployed people. Government is planning and is consciously choosing to increase unemployment by an extra 2 million people. They think will be coming off the JobKeeper payment. I can guarantee you that a lot of those people will be young people. So we're looking at a swelling stock of unemployed young people that will be in that position for a long period of time. And we are at a point where we can say that business investment has collapsed. The private sector is not going to be able to lead our reconstruction, contrary to a lot of the claims of this business-led recovery narrative. What will happen is it'll be public funding and public money that will be recreating job opportunities. And it is of the highest importance that government start thinking about how to repair jobs pathways that prioritise building up the skills and capacities of young people. So, some of the stuff that we are talking about, the Centre for Future Work, are things like what does a long-term, sustained, public-led COVID reconstruction agenda look like that could put people back into jobs and get our economy back on its feet after we've dealt with the health crisis. And there's some there's no shortage of jobs that need to be done, and meaningful, good jobs that could be direct employment from government. And we say that could be things like a public housing agenda, expanding public services in healthcare and education, renewable infrastructure and inputting that renewable technology into all of our economy, and new infrastructure more broadly. I think there's no shortage of things that have to be done, and I think young people have the capacity and want to do it. We need government to step in and provide those direct pathways, as well as, if I'll just finish on it, what's required is us to move away from these failed privatisations of our education system, because as people are training up, leaving other professions, going into new ones, or entering in for the first time in the case of young people, they're going to need affordable, accessible skills and training. And so we're saying that the TAFE system should be reconstituted as the public centre of VET, and the university sector desperately needs funding. And we should move away from a fee structure so that young people aren't carrying the brunt of debt as they are looking and placing themselves into new jobs.
Thank you for that, Alison. You brought up a point there that got me thinking, and Amit, I'd love you to share your thoughts on this. What do you think we can learn from other economies? So, we're talking about, different things that, we can do as a country, but what's happening internationally? Are there things that we can learn from other economies?
Thanks, Lorraine. I agree with what Alison was sort of saying about sort of the fundamental kind of understandings around sort of labour market dynamics and the impacts that it has on young people. Specifically, I think when you think about there's a misperception, I think, about the labour market, where people sort of think that whenever there's sort of any spare capacity in the labour market, it can immediately be filled by the existing labour market. It's just not how the labour market itself actually works. There's always people coming into the labour market. So when you fall out of the labour market, actually going back into it is a really difficult and pressing challenge. And this is not my opinion. This is not Alison's opinion. This is actually the opinion. Last week, the Reserve Bank governor gave a speech basically worrying about this at a really, in a very serious way. I think what is interesting about this crisis is that it's exposed what we've been talking about for some time about the kind of pressures around work and the way in which, as work has diversified, the degree of protections that we have for people and the way in which it works hasn't sort of kept up. And what the crisis has done is it's exposed that. And now we know that people are working in a whole bunch of different ways. What we need to do is meet them in the way in which they work and protect them in the way in which they work. What is interesting is the way in which people have responded through this crisis. And I'm going to use a really strange example. I'm actually going to use the example of the United States, right? The CARES Act, which is the CARES Act, which was probably the largest expansion of the US safety net in probably 60 years, right? Albeit temporary, right, is a really interesting example of how you can use the crisis to think about how you plug holes in the social safety net. So what that did was it expanded unemployment insurance to all manner of workers. So it extended unemployment insurance to employees, but also to contractors. It extended the way in which you think, the way in which sort of state-funded skills programs operated. It extended the range of insurances that are available for the way in which people worked. Now, unfortunately, that is a temporary scheme, right? But what I think is interesting is the way in which other governments have thought about this process prior to COVID. And so prior to the current pandemic and the crisis that came from it, there were interesting moves in the way in which the French government was thinking about social charters and the way in which it was going to construct sort of protections around a broader set of work. It's interesting the way in which we were thinking about ways in which other smaller sub-national units of government had thought about ways to incentivize and create conditions through standards of work. And then I think what is interesting is the way in which we've seen in a response to the crisis, governments extending the sort of social safety net. And in particular, I use the example of the United States because it has been a place that has traditionally been pretty hesitant around these types of moves. What I think is interesting about the way forward is about a week and a half ago, the Victorian government released a study which had been, the Natalie James inquiry, which had been going on for quite some time and was a very detailed and very deliberate piece of work. And I think it's worth everybody that is interested in the subject of the on-demand workforce, it's worth consulting. But it had a really important point, and it basically suggested that there should be essentially a set of sort of accountability standards of the type that is proposed in the report that's being released today. And what is interesting about it is that that report suggests that those standards are built around a set of principles, essentially building it up from what we expect as a society of how work should operate, and then ensuring that it is applied to the most amount of workers. And I go back to the original theme. I think the challenge for us here is making sure that people are working in different ways, right? The role of society isn't to change the nature of that work, because they're working in those different ways for a whole range of good and bad reasons. The reasons what society's role is, or what we should think about as people that are interested in improving, in a progressive society that's willing to sort of improve the nature of work, is to think about ways in which we meet them and lift those standards through a range of different tools.
Thanks for that, Amit. I'm checking out the chat, and there are like some great conversations, awesome comments happening on there. And we've actually got a few questions that people have sent in. So I'm just gonna throw them over to some of our panelists. I'd like to start off with Kelly. There's someone who's asked a question. I'll just read it out to you. It says, does the research include any views from young people about what union members and officials need to do to make union membership more attractive for young people? Do you have anything to share on that? We've got a few questions about union related things. So Kelly, does the research include anything around that?
Thanks, Lorraine. We actually did run a series of focus groups with young people, both pre and during the COVID pandemic. And although not all of this detail is in the report, what was incredibly interesting was the low number of young people who really knew what a union was, had ever heard of them, didn't know how to access them. Of course, this is not a nationally representative sample, but I think it absolutely indicates that there needs to be a lot more education for young people on what unions are and what their purpose is, so they can make an informed choice about their participation. We also heard from a lot of young people throughout those focus groups that they wanted easily accessible information that could tell them about their own personal circumstances and their rights and what they should expect. So there was a lot of that type of conversation that went along.
Thanks for that, Kelly. I'm going to throw, I guess, a similar question to Roshan and Ishara. And I know that I've also got Lewis, another young person who's on here on the call with us today. I guess I wanted to know, well, one, do you know much about unions? So to what, you know, FYA was finding in these focus groups, do you know much about unions? And if you do you feel they represent your needs? Any one of you can feel to, can jump in and answer that question if you like.
I'll jump in first then. My previous positions before this year, before COVID, were working within the university I was involved in. And because I was a full-time student, it meant that for obvious reasons, I couldn't be working full-time. So I was working on a casual basis. And as you know, as most people know, working university, whenever you're working in the university, particularly as a young person, you're typically working on a casual basis anyway. I was working a range of kind of professional development and also academic related roles. So in terms of my academic role, which was tutoring, course tutoring, I was aware of the union that was, you know, based in the university, because you'd get the email straight away because you're registered as a casual worker in the university. And I didn't have a need for it at the time because I didn't run into any complications, but you know, their presence was known and their support was known, and there were, you know, flyers everywhere across campus and everything. So it was good to know that they're there. But I think, you know, and this is obviously not for me in my lived experience, but well, in terms of feeling recognized for your work in casual work, you often get paid a high rate, but your work hours are very little. So in a sense, you're underpaid for the work that you're doing, because the amount of work that you're doing is not fully paid. And therefore, I remember having an issue with the structure of that, because it was different in different faculties and schools who had similar positions. Young workers were getting paid different rates, and the amount of work that everyone was doing was the same. So it called for, you know, a kind of ethics review in terms of we should be standardizing how people get paid for the same kind of work. But as young people who are studying and working and doing a whole bunch of other stuff just so then they can be employable after they graduate, they don't have the time. I didn't have the time to, you know, pursue that issue in the union and fight for it, because at least I was getting paid for my work. So, you know, I think it goes both ways. The union has to be there to kind of be responsive to the kind of issues that we face, rather than it being a situation where young people often go to consult about the issues in the first place. I think it should be reciprocal in terms of what issues are there and the union being there, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ishara. Lewis or Roshan, do either one of you want to comment on that? All right, we'll move on. We've got a question from Vanessa Sheriff. Now, Vanessa, I'm happy for you to ask the question yourself if you'd like, so you can just unmute yourself and then you can jump straight into the question.
Thanks, Lorraine. Really appreciate the opportunity. Just before I go to my question, I just want to make a comment about how important it is that we educate people at school about how work works, and also about unions. I think what the report shows that students don't know a lot about work, and we really need to make that a core subject at school. So my question was just in relation to the flexibility of work. How are young people expected to try and get home loans when flexible work seems to be increasing? Thanks.
Thanks for that, Vanessa. Alison, Amit, Kelly, I'm going to throw you under the bus. And I'd love to hear what you guys think on that one.
I mean, young people have been systematically cut out of accessing secure housing, and so much of the Australian economy is built up into accessing owner-occupied housing, and our finance system is linked into it, and a lot of our citizenship and our concepts of contribution are based on that, having that secure job as entry into the home, making a family, all those sorts of things. So it is absolutely a contradiction, and something that exposes not just young people to insecurity by not being able to access owner-occupied housing, and therefore under the thumb of some very not generous tenancy protections for renters. But it's not just about their insecurity, because it undermines overall access to housing and issues of inequality for all of society and the economy. So if the question is how are they supposed to do it, well, they're not. Like, young people are, I'm into my 30s, and I would say owner occupation for people in my age group should be close to double higher if it was of comparable generations. And that shows that overall that our housing settings, whether it would be like very generous tax incentives for negative gearing and for investors, and the fact that we've had, this consistent asset price inflation, houses get more and more expensive, wages not keeping up, security of employment not keeping up. This is going to create, and it is already creating, some pretty significant economic and social tensions in Australia. And my solution, or my response to that, is the only way we're going to be able to take some of the heat out of this overheated, private, commoditized market for housing is to introduce more social housing. Australia used to have a lot more, but it had been sold off over really from the 50s onwards. And we need to start moving towards other, comparable advanced economies whereby people have access to affordable, secure housing in whatever form of tenancy they want. They should have the freedom to access that.
I think, Alison, you make a really salient point, and in fact, through the research, this was a key risk that young people themselves identified as an issue for flexible work. And obviously, our systems still see that full-time work is the norm, or what we should expect of the majority of people, yet that's not necessarily what young people have access to or are accessing. So it's not just our employment system that needs to stop viewing work as a binary between full-time and other. It's all of our systems as well. So housing is definitely one that young people identify as an issue.
I agree with Alison and Kelly, and if we wanted to talk about the catastrophe of housing policy in Australia over the last 30 years, we'd probably need another few hours for that. But I think there's one thing I just wanted to highlight in addition to the things that Alison and Kelly said, which is that Australia, while we have a relatively low level of government or public debt, we have a very high level of private debt. The household debt in Australia is one of the highest in the developed world, and a function of that is because of the high price of housing and the high price of sort of mortgage debt that comes with it. And I think that's something that we need to be very concerned about as we are about to enter a recession for the first time in 29 years. To put that into context, there were 6 million Australians who were not even born the last time we had a recession, and there were about somewhere between 3 or 4 million Australians that did not live in Australia the last time we had a recession. We're talking about a set of economic conditions for which, frankly, we are unprepared for or have no memory of. And so when we think about the fundamental conditions in which we are about to embrace, position those things, it's really challenging. On the specific issue about how do you think about access to housing and employment, I think that this has really been something that is of concern to many policymakers on this front. In fact, probably the leading thinker, the leading American sort of legislator on this topic, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, introduced actually 3 years ago a bill into the Congress which essentially changed the way in which you thought about sort of credit metrics and the way in which American banks evaluated mortgages to allow more independent workers or workers that had variable incomes to effectively be able to apply for loans, or to at least be able to get a kind of credit score that enabled them to be able to use their various sources of income over a period of time to be able to account for the way in which they could pass certain tests. I think that there are certain types of ways in which we need to think about the recognition of income, the reporting of income, and the nature of the sort of variability and the insurances that sort of are associated with that type of income that then can help support this kind of argument. They're obviously all need to be supported by fundamentally the right policy settings, but I think that there is some attention being paid to how people think about that sort of inequality, so how they think about the recognition of income through different types of flexible work. I think one of the dangers of flexible work is, as we said at the start of this discussion, one of the dangers of flexible work is that for some people it is incredibly beneficial. For some people it allows them to work at home, stay at home. It allows them to spend time with their families. It allows them to care for their kids and care for their parents. It allows them to do a whole bunch of different things that are positive. But for some people, it doesn't allow that. I mean, for some people, it actually is, it doesn't work in the way in which it ought to, right? And I think one of the risks out of this crisis is that wedge, that gap of inequality becomes stronger and more pronounced as a result of that. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about ways in which we can think about closing that. And part of that is dealing with the types of scaffolding and new types of standards which are proposed in the report.
Thank you for answering that, and for all of you for your comments on that one. I've got another one that's come in over here. I wanted to find out from all, so from Amit, Kelly, and Alison, happy for any one of you to comment on this one, but what are your views about a permanent universal income in trying to balance, all the bits and the things with the flexible economy? Yeah, love to hear some of your views on that.
I'm brave enough to go first.
I knew it.
I think that the conditions of this pandemic and the disease containment strategies we need to pull through is already lending itself to this conclusion that some sort of livable basic income for people is a necessity. The unemployment benefits scheme, which is now called Job Seeker, which after we include the effects of the Victorian shutdowns on unemployment figures, we'll see a massive spike in unemployment, and certainly government is planning to increase the number of unemployed. It's kind of, we're at a point where it's near impossible to say that this payment is supposed to be about seeking jobs. There are no jobs. So if we acknowledge that part of our disease containment strategy means we are intentionally shutting down large sections of the economy to keep people safe and to save lives, then people have to be given a basic level of income that allows them to have a good life, right? That has to be enough money to buy fresh food, medicines, see a dentist now and then. And all humans deserve that. And I think that there's been this sort of ongoing debate about the best way to use government and public sector levers to provide a better life for people. And it's been this playoff between do we guarantee people the right to a job, a minimum wage job, or is it a basic income we guarantee? I think our conditions, the reality of this crisis is already lending itself to at least the first conclusion we can make, which is, first of all, why not both? But then for starters, we should say that that income level, that basic level of income that's being provided to now millions of Australians should be set at a livable level, rather than one that allows employers to incentivize people to get so desperate that they take precarious, crappy jobs, which is what government is planning to do with this unemployment benefit system. So I think it's absolutely, we should be talking about the role of a livable income for everyone. And also we should be aware that the government has consciously chosen last week, by cutting the payment by $300, to push people out of the home, which is not safe, to be taking up insecure and low paid jobs, which are also not safe for us at this time.
Kelly and Amit, any comments on that one?
I think Alison summarized it right, that she was brave enough to go first. So I'm not that brave by going second, but I think that what the sort of what the crisis has kind of highlighted, as I said again, as I say again, is I think it's highlighted the kind of the precarity of work across the sort of spectrum of all the jobs that are available in the labour market, and this is beyond what we think of as the formal labour market to all the people that are working in roles that aren't necessarily always counted. I think what is interesting is thinking about how we can sort of ensure that the support that we provide coming out of this crisis on a long-term basis is targeted towards the people that need that amount of support. And I think that for that reason, my kind of point of I guess my sort of perspective on this is that we need to think about ways in which we can provide support to those that need it the most in a tailored way, that in a tailored and a targeted way that can help them the most, and not necessarily support those at the other end of the spectrum. But I want to sort of qualify that a little bit to say that this crisis has had much larger impacts on a much more pronounced set of industries, and we're seeing that sort of reflected in the nature of the way in which people's sort of experience of work will come through. We've talked a lot about young people. In fact, actually, to take sort of Alison's point before, or sorry, no, to take Ishara's point before, where she was saying that it's not just the rates of pay, it's also the number of hours. You know, I mean, heavily casualized industries are also industries that are dominated by women. I think that we've seen the sort of pressures placed on industries in hospitality, but we also have had significant pressures in the care sector. The care sector has been a sector in which there's been pressure around sort of casualization and incomes and the quality of work and what those implications are. So I think the answer to the question is, I think we need to think maybe a bit more carefully about a period which we're currently in, which is the response to the crisis. And then when we think about the recovery and what we think the future economy should look like, about ways in which we can target and lift the quality of work so that there's a baseline that we can expect across the economy.
I think being the third and final response is also a bit of a cop-out over here, so excuse me for being the last one to the party, but I think both really great points. And I suppose fundamentally the idea that just any job will do for job seekers is fundamentally damaging. And when we look at the effects that a bad job can have on people in terms of mental health costs, lower well-being, physical risk at the moment, there's a real sense that it's not just any job will do, it needs to be a good job. So if people don't have access to good work, then there needs to be some sort of safety net that protects them. And I think that's absolutely right. I don't know exactly what that should be. I haven't spent a long time, looking into all of the different options, but I think we would agree that a safety net is necessary.
And so Kelly, just bringing it back to the good work standard, because I feel like, you've kind of touched on that. Why is it then important? Why do you reckon the good work standard is important?
Well, I think what we know is that good work is a multi-dimensional concept, and it differs from person to person. What one person needs isn't necessarily what someone else needs, and it can vary vastly based on the type of work you're in and your drivers for engaging with it. So having a set of articulated principles that is universally sort of agreed to as the foundation for what good work looks like, I think is incredibly important. To go back to an idea of a social contract, like what are we all collectively agreeing is good work, and what's excluded from that is really important to understand. And moving that forward, can it form the basis of formal regulation or a code of conduct, or there is a number of different ways to take it forward, but I think it's very important to have an articulated set of principles that we all agree to.
And with that, I'd be interested to hear, so this will be our final question, so hopefully we're going to round it off nicely and hopefully quickly. I'd be interested to hear from, firstly, the young people on our panel. So Roshan, Ishara, or Lewis, what do you need or want from, for lack of a better word, the older people to assist in developing good work standards? What do you need or want from older people that you think will help assist in developing good work standards?
Oh, I don't think I'll be able to put in much help for this. I mean, my conditions are quite different than the rest. I suppose I haven't been impacted too much, and my work, I'm an independent contractor for labour work and real estate, so I'm not too involved, I suppose, with too many people. Real estate wise, I would be with the older community, but I suppose, yeah, with the virus, that's come to a fair bit of a halt for me.
Ishara and Roshan?
If Roshan, do you have anything to add, or do you want me to go next? Okay. So just really briefly, I find this. Thank you for the question. It's interesting because it was only until last year I was my previous paid position was in entrepreneurial education in my university, and I was facilitating workshops to high school students and to younger university students around the future of work. And what that means is the future of work in terms of the fourth, in quotes, fourth industrial revolution, which includes, technological innovation, which is normally championed by young people. So people between, 25 up until 35, because they're working in the startup space or, bringing innovation into workspaces. It's interesting because there's no, in facilitating those kind of conversations, there's no follow-up around if you don't get into a government or a corporate job, what avenues are there for you? There's no conversation around that in employability, in employability divisions in education, whether it be tertiary or high school. There's a kind of hidden agenda where students, young people, are pushed to believe that corporate and government work is the ideal type of work, whereas there are people I know in the not-for-profit and the social enterprise and startup space who do get paid and get paid well and are paid fairly, and it's good work, but that work is typically defined by a lot of hard work from the ground up. In terms of what, as a young person and someone who's recently just graduated as well, I was unemployed for a period of time this year, and I did lose hope. There's also the fact that I am a person of color, so there may be hiring biases in terms of my name, just in terms of, the application, which jobs I applied for, etc. So after a while, I just decided I will continue in the not-for-profit space in terms of volunteering, which is still work. The amount of work that you put in is still work, but I think from people in higher age cohorts, the fact that there was around 200 plus people in this event, staying tuned to people like us and listening to us and being concerned about these issues means that you all are fighting for change and know that this structure, the system structure, has to change because it's not flexible for the COVID situation, which by default means it's not flexible for intergenerational equity, and will most likely contribute to intergenerational wealth and social inequality for many people, and most importantly for youth in this context. But I think as a young person, what we ask for is more advocacy from older generations and older age cohorts, because we also get tired. There's only so much we can yell about and fight for our work, but also take that back into the work that you need to do to reform, restructure, whatever it is you're in, because it means that you're putting intergenerational equity at the forefront of reform.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that, Ishara, as well as Lewis. Yes, I know our time is up. It has been a great discussion, and thank you all so much for sending in your questions and your thoughts and getting the conversation going in the chat as well. Yeah, it's been fantastic. I just want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your time. Once again, I want to thank our panelists for joining us as well and sharing their different thoughts. I also would like to thank again our funder, Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and for being one of our major partners in this and making this happen. Obviously, please visit the FYA website for a copy of the report, and to reach out to FYA if you want to continue discussing this report and any of our other work. As always, I know that there is more of these events coming up here at Australia at Home. I think tomorrow we've got the Geek Fest with The Guardian's Catherine Murphy and Peter Lewis discussing the Essential Report and launching of the new 2PP+. So please feel free to log in and continue having great discussions. Australia at Home is designed to be a meeting place for civil society, for people to come together and make a positive impact in solidarity with one another throughout this time. It's a project of Essential, The Guardian, Centre for Australian Progress, Principal Co, Maurice Blackburn, and Community Council for Australia and ACF. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye.